Imagine a world where the most powerful armored force ever assembled was defeated not by enemy steel, but by a simple, empty 5-gallon can. In September 1944, as the Third Reich teetered on the brink of total collapse, a secret war was being waged behind Allied lines. A war of ego, shadows, and hijacked supplies. Why did the Supreme Allied Commander choose to halt the most aggressive general in history at the very moment he reached the German border? And was the war's end delayed by 6 bloody months simply to settle a personal rivalry between two titans? General George S. Patton realized his Third Army was no longer fighting the Wehrmacht, but a far more formidable foe, the absolute crushing weight of logistical reality. The triumph of the Normandy breakout had created a monster of its own success, a pursuit so rapid that the supply lines stretching back to the beaches had finally snapped under the strain. As the lead elements of the Third Army reached the Meuse River, Patton found himself in a desperate race not for territory, but for the precious petroleum, oil, and lubricants, the POL that fueled his armored juggernaut. Every single day, his columns devoured nearly 400,000 gallons of gasoline, a staggering requirement that planners had never anticipated would need to be delivered hundreds of miles inland by this date. Back at the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, General Dwight D. Eisenhower faced an impossible leadership dilemma that would define the final months of the war in Europe. He sat between two of the most vainglorious and brilliant commanders in military history, each demanding the lion's share of the limited resources for their own single thrust into the heart of the Third Reich. In the North, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery lobbied with calculated precision, arguing that all resources should be concentrated in his 21st Army Group for a narrow, powerful strike toward the Ruhr. He viewed Patton's aggressive maneuvers in the South as a reckless diversion of the fuel that could otherwise end the war by Christmas if given to the British and Canadian forces. The tension between these two titans was not merely a matter of ego, but a fundamental clash of military philosophies that threatened to tear the Allied coalition apart at the moment of its greatest opportunity. Patton believed that speed was the only way to prevent the Germans from manning the Siegfried Line, famously remarking that if they gave him the gas, he could be in Germany in 48 hours. However, behind the scenes of this grand strategy, a shadow war was being waged to keep the Supreme Commander informed of what his generals were actually doing in the field. This was the era of the GHQ Liaison Regiment, the secretive phantom units, whose primary mission was to bypass the official chain of command and report the real-time location and resource status of forward units. These phantom officers, often operating in small, highly mobile jeep patrols, were the eyes and ears that Eisenhower used to monitor Patton's true consumption of fuel. While Patton's official reports might suggest he was out of gas and stationary, the phantom radio codes, using mundane words like sugar and tea to hide tactical movements, often told a very different story of a general who refused to stop. To bridge the widening gap between the ports and the front, the U.S. Army launched the Red Ball Express, an unprecedented lifeline consisting of nearly 6,000 trucks running 24 hours a day on a one-way loop across France. These drivers, the majority of whom were African-American soldiers, faced a grueling suicide pace, driving 20-hour shifts through blackout conditions and monsoon rains. The Red Ball Express was a feat of sheer will, yet it carried within it the seeds of a profound internal friction, as the very trucks meant to supply the First and Third Armies often became targets for the desperate combat units they were supposed to serve. In the chaos of the Lorraine campaign, the line between liberating supplies and outright military piracy began to blur among the rank and file. Within the Third Army, a culture of midnight requisitions took hold, where soldiers were encouraged by a wink and a nod from their commanders to secure the resources they needed by any means necessary. It wasn't uncommon for Patton's pirates to hijack entire fuel convoys destined for General Courtney Hodges' First Army, rerouting them under the cover of darkness to their own depots. These irregular practices involved the rapid repainting of truck bumpers and the forging of transport orders to deceive the military police who guarded the vital intersections of the Red Ball route. It was a rebellion of the combat arms against the logistical tyranny of the rear echelon, born from the belief that a gallon of gas in a tank on the front was worth more than 1,000 tons of paperwork in Paris. This period also saw the strange intersection of the real war and the deceptive world of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the legendary Ghost Army. While Patton's real tanks were being immobilized by a lack of fuel, The artisan engineers of the Ghost Army were deploying inflatable rubber Shermans to draw German attention away from the gaps in the Allied line. The historical irony was palpable. The Germans were being fooled by a phantom force of balloons, while the actual armored power of the United States was being held hostage by a shortage of 5-gallon jerry cans. This was the poetic justice that logistical planners later noted. The Third Army, having bypassed the vital ports of Brittany in its race east, now felt the shortage most acutely. As September wore on, the supply famine deepened, and the strategic gamble of the broad front advance began to look like a disastrous miscalculation. The Germans, given a moment to breathe as the Allied tanks ran dry, began to reorganize their defenses along the Meuse River, turning what should have been a pursuit into a bloody, grinding war of attrition. The cost of this logistical friction was not just measured in gallons or miles, but in the thousands of lives that would be lost in the coming months as the war was forcibly extended into the winter of 1944. The decision to halt the Third Army's momentum remains one of the most debated moments of the conflict, a leadership secret that still echoes through the halls of West Point. The silence that descended upon the Third Army's motor pools was a deafening indictment of the Allied supply chain. But in the shadows of the City of Light, a far more insidious threat was emerging from within the American ranks. As the official flow of fuel to the front slowed to a trickle, a massive underground empire was born in the newly liberated Paris, fueled by the very resources the frontline soldiers were dying for. This was the era of the military black market, where leakage from the supply depots at Beret and Miramas became a flood of illicit profit. Investigations would eventually reveal that thousands of American GIs had deserted their units to form sophisticated criminal gangs, such as the notorious Vincennes and Voltaire gangs, who operated with a level of organization that rivaled the Army itself. Led by men like Private First Class James Clyde Blackburn and Walter Medley, these AWOL soldiers used stolen Army trucks and forged transport orders to siphon hundreds of thousands of gallons of gasoline from the supply chain. They sold this liquid gold to a desperate French public, and even to unscrupulous elements within the military, while Patton's tankers were forced to drain the fuel from their own heaters just to keep their engines warm. The psychological weight of this internal betrayal was immense for the commanders in the field. General George Patton, who prized discipline and aggression above all else, was forced to confront the reality that some of his own men were prioritizing the black market over the mission. He viewed these thieves not just as criminals, but as a disgrace to the millions of GIs who had come to Europe to fight against indecency. By mid-September, the logistical crisis reached a fever pitch during a pivotal meeting between Eisenhower, Montgomery, and Bradley. Eisenhower, still hoping for a quick end to the war, made the controversial decision to authorize Operation Market Garden, a daring but logistically fragile attempt to vault the Rhine. This decision effectively diverted the bulk of the remaining Allied fuel and transport to the north, leaving Patton's Third Army virtually stranded in the mud of Lorraine. Patton was heartbroken, describing the decision as the momentous error of the war. He watched as his momentum vanished, his tanks becoming little more than stationary pillboxes. To compensate, the midnight requisitions intensified. His soldiers became masters of camouflage and deception, not to fool the Germans, but to hide their liberated fuel stashes from the prying eyes of the Supreme Headquarters auditors and the British Phantom liaison officers. The rivalry between Patton and Montgomery took on a personal, almost visceral quality during this fuel famine. Patton believed Montgomery was dithering at Antwerp, failing to open the vital port that could have solved the supply crisis weeks earlier. In his private memoirs, Patton's entries grew caustic, fueled by the frustration of seeing his legendary mobility sacrificed on the altar of Montgomery's set-piece caution. Meanwhile, on the roads of France, the Red Ball Express drivers were reaching the breaking point. The stress of constant driving through combat zones, combined with the knowledge that their cargoes were often being siphoned off by black marketeers, led to a dangerous collapse in morale. Yet they pushed on, their trucks literally falling apart beneath them, tires shredding and engines seizing, from a lack of spare parts that had also been diverted to the northern thrust. The what-if of this period is haunting. Had Eisenhower banked everything on a single thrust by the Third Army in early September? Would the Siegfried Line have fallen before the winter snows? Historical records suggest that the German defenses were so disorganized that a concentrated armored strike might have reached the Rhine virtually unopposed. Instead, the Allied broad front strategy allowed the Wehrmacht to execute a miracle of reorganization. As the rains of October began to turn the French countryside into a quagmire, the logistical tyranny became absolute. The Third Army found itself stuck in the mud before the fortified city of Metz, engaged in a costly struggle for a city that might have been bypassed entirely if the tanks had only had the fuel to keep moving in August. The handmaiden of battle had truly become war's mistress, dictating every tactical move. The Ghost Army continued its ruse, but the stakes were no longer a game of shadows. They were now the only thing holding certain sectors of the line, while Patton's real divisions were shifted and cannibalized for resources. The artist soldiers of the 23rd understood that if the Germans realized the divisions in front of them were made of rubber and speakers, the entire southern flank could collapse. By late 1944, the American press began to catch wind of the black market scandal, with Life magazine publishing a shocking exposé on the Voltaire gang. The scale of the leakage, at least 22 truckloads of gasoline in one investigation alone, sent shockwaves through the American public. It was a sobering reminder that war brings out the best and the worst in humanity, often at the same time. The internal friction between the combat commanders and the communication zone, the rear echelon responsible for supply, left deep scars on the efficiency of the army. Patton's open contempt for the desk-bound generals in Paris fueled a culture of institutionalized rule-breaking that, while effective in the short term, undermined the very order that a modern military requires to function over the long haul. As we look back at the campaign of autumn 1944, the strategic pillars of the Allied victory are clear, but so are the fractures that nearly broke the coalition. The fuel crisis was not merely a technical failure. It was a leadership secret that revealed the limits of American industrial might when faced with the sheer geography of a continent. The tanks of the Third Army were the most powerful weapons in the world, but without the humble 5-gallon jerrycan, they were nothing but ghosts. The war would eventually be won, but the price of the logistical rebellion and the strategic hesitation of September 1944 was paid in the cold, bloody forests of the Ardennes just a few months later. George Patton would eventually cross the Rhine, but he would do so with a heavy heart, knowing that the war had been won in spite of the logistical chaos, not because of its perfect execution. This is the story of the World War II that the history books often skip. The war of the grease-stained mechanics, the exhausted truck drivers, and the desperate commanders who learned that in the age of armor, the greatest enemy isn't the man in the opposite trench, but the empty fuel gauge staring back at you from the dashboard. If you were in Eisenhower's shoes in September 1944, would you have gambled everything on Patton's armored thrust to Berlin? Or was Montgomery's cautious approach to opening the ports the only logical choice? Let us know your strategic take in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.